It's Fungus Day, woo! Okay, so our next presentation is by Steve Farrar. He is the co-owner of Mushrooms, and we are very excited to have him do a presentation today on his expertise, which is mushrooms. So without further ado.
All right. Well, thank you guys for showing up for our 24th annual Fungus Fair. Is this the first time for most of you people coming to a Fungus Fair here? Yes, it is. So I'd encourage you to join the Mycological Society if you can. It's not expensive, and there's we do a lot of interesting stuff. Organized forays. Now, San Diego County is not the best place for mushroom hunting by any means. An irrigated desert. Mushroom sightings can be few and far between. Some of the species here only fruit maybe once every 15 years. So, but there is a lot of mushrooms here. So I am the co-founder and chief technical officer at M2 Ingredients, which is the core company that produces a land of some branded retail products. We grow all the mushrooms up in North County, in Carlsbad and in San Marcos. And I've been growing mushrooms here in San Diego County for about 40 years. Most of that time growing exotic species for the culinary produce industry. Since about 2008, getting more involved in medicinal mushrooms. They're used in traditional Chinese medicine and selling them as powders in a variety of different formulations. Now this title, it's a bit of an ambitious title, I must say, but mushroom people are kind of like that. We get very excited about it, and my intent here, I'm going to cover a lot of ground, not to go in depth into anything in particular, but to try to get you guys excited to go down some rabbit holes that you'll never get out of. But be careful, mushrooms, they draw you in, and a lot of times you never get back out of it, but it's a fun journey, I'll tell you. Next slide, please. So that's what we do. A little bit about our company. We grow them, we dry them, we mill them, and we package them. And that's kind of our game. Medicinal mushrooms, they're all certified 100% organic, kosher certified, all the good things, and they are local. Next slide, please. When we have a number, we sell as wholesale bulk ingredients to other producers that put it in their products. So if you're seeing protein powders with mushroom in it, or coffee with mushroom, and a lot of times it'll be stuff that we grow here in North County. We have a organic mushroom superfood, human retail product line, as well as a pet and equine line. The mushrooms work just as well on pets and horses as they do on people. Next slide. And we've come up with a number of different products. One of the reasons, the idea was, with our business model, is to produce bulk ingredients for other companies so it can reach a scale economy that it made sense that we're efficient with doing that. Secondarily, we wanted to develop our own branded retail lines to be able to kind of almost an educational foundation to be able to increase awareness of mushrooms. And we definitely wanted to incorporate mushrooms into a more wider variety of products. Previously, if you could find medicinal mushrooms in the store, it was in the dietary supplement product in capsules. It was very seasonal sales during the cold and flu season. By incorporating into a more variety of products that are more consumer friendly and convenient, we expanded the use of it significantly. And that's kind of our game. And now you're seeing mushrooms in everything. Coffee, chocolate, kombucha, even in beers and wine sometime. So next slide. So again, mushrooms are that's not the best place to find mushrooms in the wild in San Diego County, but there have been a number of farms in San Diego County. Several of them have gone over business over the years due to urban encroachment, places that build a farm out in the middle of nowhere and have compost and stuff going on, and then they build houses around it, and then the people would say, "What are you doing growing mushrooms here? We've got our houses here," and they've run it out. So San Luis Rey Mushroom Farm in Valley Center went out of business. Palmer Mountain Mushroom Farm, not so much from encroachment, but economic. They were kind of way out there. Rincon Mushroom Farm in Valley Center grew button mushrooms out of business. And then the company that I originally started with, Golden Ray Mushrooms, we kind of transitioned out of growing fresh mushrooms into growing medicinal ones. Next one, please. There are some ongoing mushroom operations going on. Mountain meadow mushrooms in Escondido, they grow button mushrooms and creminis on a composted manure-based substrate. They're now transitioning into growing exotics, things like shiitake, lion's mane, and king oyster on non-composted wood-based and straw-based substrates. Next slide. There's also the Hokuto Kanoko mushroom farm in Japan, in San Marcos, a Japanese mushroom farm actually. That was on the site of our original golden glory mushroom farm, and we transitioned and helped them set up to grow. And it's what I call a robotic mushroom farm. They grow organic maitake, king trumpet, and 2 varieties of beach mushrooms in what's called a Japanese polypropylene bottle technology, where you grow the mushrooms out of reusable polypropylene bottles that can be sterilized, autoclaved. Excellent mushrooms, if you can find them. They're in local stores, and they're excellent. Next slide. And there are a number of other mushroom growing operations here, more on a smaller scale. Golden Mushroom Company, they've got a booth here. They grow fresh mushrooms. Mueller's Mushrooms, he does exotics and mushroom growing kits and tinctures. He's also got a booth here. Mindful Mushrooms, I'm not too familiar with them. And then the last speaker, Joshua, with the mushroom composites materials. And then there is one other farm in Bonzel. It's called CCD. It stands for China City Development. Now they grow what they call Product of USA mushrooms. But what their model is they get mushroom logs coming out of China that are shipped on a boat. They bring them in, unload them, bring them into a greenhouse, open them up and fruit them, and call that Product of USA. I don't agree with that. I think they're product of China still, because they're growing on a Chinese substrate, and China is good at growing mushrooms, but they're not good at maintaining their environment. And there's a lot of toxins in the environment of China that ends up being bioaccumulated in mushrooms. So beware of Chinese mushrooms. It's kind of you roll the dice when you eat a Chinese mushroom product. That's my opinion, and many people have other opinions, but buy local in my mind. Next slide, please. Now, the kingdom fungi, it's a big kingdom, and it actually is a kingdom of its own. And it's a much larger kingdom people imagine. For every species of plant on planet Earth, there's anywhere from 6 to maybe up 15 species of fungi. Now, all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. Mushrooms make up only about 10% of the known fungal species actually produce what we call the macrofungus fruit body, the sexual organ of the mushroom. So, and really only about 120,000 of these, somewhere between 1.5 and 5 million species, have been formally identified by taxonomists. So it's a wide open field for people to do a lot of work in, and there's a lot of work yet to be done. In North America, we've got maybe 10,000 species. Only about 250 of those are edible, and maybe only half of those are worth eating. And an equal number is poisonous. Mushrooms, kind of get the idea of people are afraid of them of being poisonous, but there's poisonous plants as well. We eat plants all the time. We just don't eat the poisonous ones. The same with mushrooms. Don't eat the poisonous ones. All mushrooms can be eaten once, but some of them just once. And maybe 200 species grown commercially, but only about 20 really commercial level. Next slide. And with all that big, huge kingdom, people have different ways of classifying them. Now, the taxonomical classifications are kind of a rabbit hole to go down. The Latin binomial names, it's particularly challenging because as with this DNA sequencing, as we start to tease apart these relationships, mushrooms that we formerly thought were closely related turned out to be distant related, and they're in different genera or even different families, and mushrooms that we thought were entirely different are actually closely related. So continually the names are being updated, and it's a nightmare. They're hard enough to remember for the first time. If it's the third and fourth name change, it's like, oh my God, give me a break. But it's important because the common names of mushrooms, they're not too common, and different people have different common names, so you want to make sure you're talking about the same species. Another way of looking at mushrooms is how they're collected and grown. They can be foraged or they can be cultivated. sometimes in very low-tech ways and some in very, very high-tech ways. I tend to grow in the kind of a high-tech manner in what is called a solid-state fermentation system that I'll talk about later. How it grows, whether it grows on dead and dying organic matter, whether it's a parasite, living as a parasite on another organism, whether it's mycorrhizal, it grows in relationships to the roots of a plant or a tree. Those are different ways of looking at mushrooms. And then from a use point, you can look at how it is used, whether it's edible, whether it's not edible and you want to kind of stay away, but there's other properties that make it useful, whether it's poison or psychoactive. And the psychoactive properties of mushrooms are getting a lot of attention. I'll get into that a bit later as a part of healing the mind part of the discussion. And then there's different parts of the mushroom use. Some people just use the mycelium, some people the fruiting body, and some species use the sclerotia. But there's a lot of ways of looking at it and a lot of ways of using these different species. And so trying to make sense of this very large and confusing kingdom that is largely unseen, you know. It's not like you can go out and see a willow tree every day of the year and it's still there, it stays in place. A lot of these mushrooms you only see once in a while when the conditions are right. So 90% of the life cycle is hidden to us, so we don't see them as much. So it's mysterious to us. And the mushrooms, fungi tend to be more closely related to animals than they are to plants. They are stuck, they can't move around like an animal can, but they do like an animal. They take in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, and they can only decompose already organic matter as a food source. The main difference is that in animals, the digestion takes inside the body in a gastrointestinal tract. In mushrooms, it takes extracellular. The mushroom mycelia exude enzymes in the environment that dissolve and liquefy the nutrients so they can be absorbed into the cell. So it's a different sort of background, but in the way they're related. And the proteins in mushrooms are much more animal-like than they are protein-like, the amino acid content. So it's a good meat alternative. Next slide, please. And the life cycle of the mushrooms. Most people, when they think of mushrooms, they think of a single stage, the end game of the mushroom, producing the above-ground fruit body that produces the spores that can be disseminated by wind, rain, animals, whatnot, to grow the next generation of mushrooms. So we think of the fruit body stage, but really, most of the stage of the mushroom takes place as the below ground or in a site of a tree or in a plant, and is a mycelium. And that's it's an extensive network of thread-like growths that Joshua, how many stayed were here for the previous contact with Joshua? It was an excellent thing. You should look for his speech. It's going to be up on YouTube. But I tend to focus on the mycelial stage because that's where really a lot of the mojo is at. Now there's some people that say that all the activity of mushrooms are in the fruit body stage. Other people say it's all in the mycelial stage. I say they're both wrong. There's value in both the mycelial and fruit body stage, not only nutritional wise, but also medicinal wise. So next stage, please. And when you kick over a rock in a moist environment, you're going to see mycelium generally. Not so much here because it's too dry, but there's what was called a wood-wide web of mycelium. Originally regarded as kind of the internet of planet Earth. It's beneath our feet in a forest. There's miles and miles of mycelium that we don't see. Every footstep that we take impacts the mycelial network in a forest. And the health of a forest depends on the health of the fungal component of the forest. I like this quote of thinking of, most people when they think of mushroom, they think of the fruit body. It's like thinking only of humans as only as in terms of their genitalia, their reproductive organs. The mushroom is just the reproductive organ of the mushroom organism, and it makes up only maybe 10% of the life cycle of the mushroom and probably less than 5% of the biomass of the total organism. So there's a lot more mycelium biomass out there than there is fruit body. Next one, please. And this is what the mycelium looks like under an electron microscope, intensively interbranched, it's very pervasive into the environment. Next slide. And as mushroom growers, a lot of times people think, well, if you're growing mushrooms, you're going to probably plant mushroom spores. You can, but that's there's some difficulties there. We tend to work with tissue cultures taken from the mycelia, and it's a working on sterilized substrates and an expansion process. We do, when you're growing the mycelium, it's hard to identify what mushroom it is. If you get mixed up, although mycelium does look different, you sometimes have to get under a microscope to see it. So we do take great care to positive idea each species we have by DNA. We maintain the master cultures that we propagate from in cryogenic storage, so it can periodically go back to the original vigor of the culture that we obtained. And then the finished powders that we produce, we also positively identify that by what is called high performance thin layer chromatography, because you want to keep the species straight, and things can get confusing with mushrooms. Next slide, please. And there is some magic mycelium. This is a very popular graphic by Autumn Sky that you see in a lot of things. I just love it. It's kind of, there is some magic to mushrooms and particularly mycelium, and it's a beautiful print. Next slide, please. And thinking of mushrooms as culinary food items, they are a very healthy, nutrient-dense food. Good protein levels, good amounts of B vitamins. They have prebiotic dietary fibers and fungal dietary fibers as prebiotics to support the microbiome, the probiotic microbiome. Brings something new to the party that just the plant-based fibers don't. Immune enhancers, alpha and beta glucans that I'll talk about a bit later, peptides, antioxidants, anti-carcinogenic activity. They're used a lot in Asia is complementary and alternative therapies to standard chemotherapies and radiation therapies for a variety of cancers. They help with maintaining cholesterol levels. Antioxidants, really a lot of antioxidants in mushrooms, including one called ergothioneine. If you get a chance, Google ergothioneine. It's a very interesting antioxidant. It's the only antioxidant that's so important to our body that we actually have an ergothioneine transport system that actually transports ergothioneine into these points of oxidative stress in your body. And mushrooms and certain soil inhabiting bacteria are the only things that produce ergothioneine. So eat more mushrooms, please. A question?
Yes. You have in parentheses next to vitamin D2, D3, and D4. Can you explain what you mean?
Yes, they've actually in some species found those other forms of vitamin D. Generally, it's the vitamin D2 form, but they have found in some species smaller amounts of D3 and D4.
So is that unusual to find D3 in a plant or a mushroom? Because, normally when we buy vitamins, D is D3, right?
Yeah, and it's generally derived from lanolin, from sheep's wool. So it's not vegan and it's not organic either, for sure. It takes quite a bit of processing. So yeah, a lot going on. Next slide, please. And when we talk about culinary mushrooms versus medicinal mushrooms, there's really not a hard line between them. There's some culinary mushrooms that are excellent eating mushrooms, culinary mushrooms, but beyond their nutritional and culinary aspects, they also have significant medicinal values that add to their value. So the ones in kind of the orangish color are ones that are considered culinary mushrooms, but also medicinal mushrooms. The ones more in black are species that you would never want to eat for dinner. They're generally kind of woody, very fibrous, bitter, not so nice tasting. But once you process them appropriately into a preparation, a powder, an extract, they have very good health benefits to it. Next slide, please. And we grow 11 different species up there. We picked 11 species, so we have a number of different species to address any health concern that you have. You got a problem, I got a mushroom for you, okay? Sometimes it seems like I'm a snake oil salesman because mushrooms do so many things, but that's what it is. It's so I kind of always have to put the brakes on our marketing people sometimes, because you say it cures everything. They think, well, that's BS, but in a way they do. A lot of active ingredients. Some of these are low molecular weight compounds. Others are very large molecular weight compounds with elegant three-dimensional helical hex DNA-like sort of structures. Some of these compounds are hot water soluble, some of them are alcohol soluble, some of them are lipid soluble, some of them are insoluble. Some of them hold up to the heat of processing, and some of them break down at relatively low temperatures. So depending on which mushroom you're taking medicinally wise, it's really important how it's processed and how it's handled and how you consume it. It's going to have quite a bit different activities to it. Next slide. A lot of therapeutic applications, again, bordering on snake oil salesman stuff, but really, mostly mushrooms are known for their effect on immune health. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later on. It's been a good product to have, an immune health product during the pandemic. We've been having a hard time keeping up with the demand. Mushrooms are really, it's a good business being right now. But also sports performance applications. Some of the species help with oxygen uptake, time to exhaustion, peak oxygen consumption, weight management aspects, healthy aging, longevity aspects to them. A lot going on with mushrooms, and depending on how you mix and match the different species, you can address different health concerns in somewhat of a targeted way. Next slide, please. Beta-glucans, those are the compounds in mushrooms that get most of the attention for helping with immune functionality. And these are polysaccharide compounds consisting of glucose molecules in a specific linkage, a beta linkage. And how they work is they actually get into our system and attach to the cell receptor sites on the cell surfaces of a different immune cells, things like natural killer cells, dendritic cells. They attach and they kind of activate, potentiate those immune cells, and that sets off a cascade of cell signal events that tends to balance and potentiate immune functionality. The important thing is that it's a host-mediated response. It involves an interaction with your immune system. You're not taking something that's going to come in and kill pathogens in your body. It's going to help your own system better deal with the pathogens, whether it be a bacteria or virus. Next slide, please. And this is just a kind of how it works. These very large beta-glucan molecules, they get engulfed by macrophages. They break them up into smaller particles, and those particles attached to receptor sites on the immune cells, and those immune cells then can more efficiently attack things like tumor cells and pathogens. So it's kind of and it's important to know that it's not immune stimulation, it's immune modulation. So not only can and if you've got a weak system, it's going to help you, but also if you've got an overactive, misdirected immune system, it can also balance that as well. That is a concept not very amenable to most Western medicine, because we always think of an agent working in a single direction. Mushrooms can be multi-directional in how they help with their health. They tend to be interactive, I would say. Next one, please. So although the beta-glucans do get the most attention in terms of their action, in terms of interacting with your immune system, there are other things in mushrooms, particularly if they're presented as a whole food, unextracted product. They've got many other things that also support immunity. Things like prebiotic dietary fibers, the antioxidant compounds that I talked about. And antioxidants are really important for immune functionality, because it turns out our immune cells are very subject to oxidative damage by free radicals, so it behooves you to neutralize those damaging free radicals as quickly as you can, to have mushrooms in your system always providing antioxidant activity to them. A lot going on. So you can get very high concentration beta-glucan products where they've been extracted with hot water and the beta-glucans have been extracted, but I think they throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're throwing out a lot of other things that also support immunity, and you get an entourage effect of multiple things working in the same direction, and there's some 1 + 1 = more than 2 a lot of times with mushrooms. So next slide, please. There's a new study going on in the University of California, San Diego, looking at how mushrooms can interact and help with COVID. They're using a couple species, turkey tail and agarikon. They were provided by a friendly competitor, Paul Stamets, the fungi perfecter. He beat me to the punch on the study. But it's important to note that these are products made, powders from the mycelium of the mushroom, not the fruit body stage. And that's what they're doing the studies on, how it interacts with the immune system, and possibly as vaccine adjuvants to extend the activity of it. And it's an ongoing study, and it's not complete yet, but it's a great study. Next slide. One of the arguments against medicinal mushrooms, they say, well, it's all anecdotal. It's based on traditional Chinese medicine, which is kind of zooby. We don't trust it. But there actually has been a lot of research done. This Robert Rogers did a book on documenting all the human clinical trials. Now, most of these human clinical trials with mushrooms have been done on isolated active ingredients extracted and concentrated from the mushrooms. Not many of them have been done on whole food mushroom powders. And the reason is that most of it has been financed by pharmaceutical companies, not necessarily wanting to increase the use of mushrooms, but to find an active ingredient that they can find out the activity, find out the agent that's doing it, then synthesize it, license it, patent, and sell it back to you as a drug. So there is a lot of research on mushrooms, but it's been with an agenda. So that's one of the problems, is that there hasn't been a whole lot of information on taking medicinal mushrooms in a whole food format that I advocate. Next slide. Now, when you're taking medicinal mushrooms, there's a number of ways you can take them. You can take them just in the fruit body stage, and those can be either mushrooms you found out in the wild or that were cultivated. You can take just the mycelium. And there's a couple ways of producing mycelium. One of them is what is called in submerged fermentation, and that's on the bottom over there, where they grow the mycelium in a liquid format in kind of a synthetic cocktail of nutrients. You sterilize in the fermentation vessel, you inoculate it with mushrooms, and then you agitate it with air, filtered air, and at the end you drain off the water and collect pure mycelium. The other way is what is called solid state fermentation. That's what I do, where I grow it on a solid substrate. I actually grow on organic oats, and that's kind of the progression where you, on the bottom there, where the oats that have been sterilized, the mycelium is just taken off on the one on the left after it's fully grown, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. And eventually you get the fruit body stage, and then that whole block of fruit bodies, biomass, and fermented substrate becomes the final product. So it's not pure mycelium, but it's got the whole life cycle of the mushroom in it. Next one, please. And here's a little bit of close-up of that one. This happens to be reishi, how we grow it, where on the left it's just been inoculated and the mycelium is just taken off. It's growing further there. It's starting to go into the fruit body stage. It's exhausted the supply of nutrients that's available to support further mycelial growth. And you can kind of see some puddles of liquid, goldish liquid. That is enzymes and secondary metabolites that the mushroom mycelium has put into the substrate. And a lot of people think that those exudates are really where most of the mojo is at. So this is a way of capturing the entire life cycle, including the fruit bodies and spores and all the extracellular compounds that the mycelium produces. And that's how I do it, basically. Next one, please. I'm going to talk about a few different species now, just a couple because I don't have much time. The best sellers that we have so far, and right now lion's mane is really our best seller. It's the one that grows wild around here. It is known as a smart mushroom. This is on the scale. There is a block of a solid massive fruit body taken from the mycelial biomass at the bottom of those growing units that I buried in. The mycelium contains one neurotrophic compound called hericium. Actually, it's not a single compound, it's a class of compounds. There's hericinones A through about P or Q right now, and the same thing with the erinaceus in the mycelium. It's a class of compounds. So if you're taking lion's mane, I would encourage you, well, to buy our product, obviously, but also to find a product that contains both the fruit body and the mycelial stage of it to get both of those active ingredients. And how they work is they actually cross the blood-brain barrier, get into our brain, and increase the synthesis of a compound called nerve growth factor that in turn can actually help you grow new neurons. If you've destroyed a few neurons in your life, you can grow them back. You can grow them back. Adult neurogenesis is what it's called. A question.
I was wondering if you guys are grinding up the fruiting bodies. How are we supposed to unlock the medicinal compounds from the chitin layer if you're not using heat or an extraction?
Good question. We do use heat. After it's grown through and we as at the first part of the dehydration moisture removal stage, we subject it to a steaming process. We steam them. And then over the course of the next 8 hours, we exhaust the moisture-laden air to dry them. So they are ready to eat and are bioavailable. That is an important question. And you can do additional heat, put it in coffee or tea, and that's gonna make it even further more available. It's in traditional Chinese medicine, they use it to treat gastric complaints and sleep disorders. Interestingly, it's one with the current trend in microdosing. I'm sorry, am I blocking your way? With Psilocybin, it's a stacking protocol where you take lion's mane to not only open up and interconnect areas of the brain, but actually grow new neurons to make new connections. So that's interesting. So during a Burning Man festival, our sales of lion's mane goes way up. I haven't quite figured why, but we have some theories on that. Next one, please. Cordyceps, that's another very interesting species that's getting a lot of attention. It's kind of a funny mushroom. Cordyceps are virtually all of them grow as parasites on different types of insects. The ones of medicinal interest grow as parasites on moth larvae, moth pupae. The Cordyceps sinensis is one that grows only in the high Himalayan areas of Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal. And entire Tibetan villages make their income of going and harvesting these little mushrooms. And they harvest both the mushroom fruit body and also the dead insect carcass, and they consume both because in the carcass you're getting the mycelium. So it's kind of a yuck factor that doesn't work well with Americans. Plus, they tend to be about $50,000 a kilogram if you can find them. Now, you can grow these artificially. I grow both species. I prefer the Militaris because the Militaris grows more vigorously on a non-insect substrate. We grow on organic oats, and it actually produces the fruit body, that orange-colored. They call it the scarlet caterpillar fungus. The sinensis doesn't produce fruit bodies. It grows much weaker, and it's a taxonomical nightmare. When you take a tissue culture from a wild cordyceps from the Himalayas and you put it on a petri dish, many things grow on it. And depending on which you pick out to grow, and people have picked out different things, and they're all calling them a cordyceps. It seems like it's not so much a single species, but a community of species parasitizing the insects. So in the market, you don't know which species they are. They all tend to, the different isolates from a petri dish, all tend to produce the same active ingredients, but it's a mess. And I definitely prefer the Militaris. And basically how it works is it increases, kind of smooths the wheels of the ATP cycle in your mitochondria to produce ATP that fuels your muscles. So a lot of sports people take it. It also tends to help increase the uptake of oxygen and delivery of oxygen to tissues. So it's used for high altitude climbers in the Himalayas, used in sports performance applications, and that's definitely one of our best sellers. It's good for people with asthma and breathing complaints, and also it has some reported to have, they call it the natural Viagra of the Himalayas. It's got increases sexual function both in males and females. So it's a popular mushroom, as you might think. Next one, please. And this is what it looks like when we're growing it. This is we grow it on kind of racks in the bags. Those little white patches are air exchange filters that allow oxygen in and carbon dioxide out, because you do have to, the mycelium does like a lot of oxygen, so we're running a lot of filtered fresh air across these bags. And that on the right there is a mass of oppressed fruit bodies. They kind of grow up against the side of it. The one that's kind of broke loose is at the top, and they do call that the scarlet caterpillar fungus because of its color, and also that in nature it grows on a caterpillar, basically. Next one, please. Now the part about healing the mind. I talked a little bit about the lion's mane, its effect on cognitive function and helping to grow new neurons. Psychoactive magic mushrooms are gaining a lot of attention. Unfortunately, they're still classified as a Schedule I drug, and I'll talk a little about that later. It's for God knows what reason. Well, the reason is Nixon and his stupid war on drugs. And we're working around that now, but it's a slow process. And there's a lot of species of mushroom that produce psychoactive compounds. Over 180 species and across about 7 different genera produce psilocybin or psilocin in various amounts. And some species can have maybe 10 times the amount of psilocybin that the next species has. So if you're engaging in this either microdosing or heroic dosing, it's good to know which species you're partaking of. Prior to the war on drugs, it was used extensively in treating addictive behaviors. There's a lot of research on it. Alcohol addictions, cigarette addictions, and it was actually insurance companies would pay for psychedelic therapy for these things. And then the war on drugs came, and it was demonized for 50 years. Now it's coming back, and they're using it end-of-life counseling, grief counseling, all sorts of antidepressant activities. So it's gaining a lot of attention, and people are working actively on decriminalizing it. Next slide, please. And in terms of harm, this is a study done in UK. Mushrooms, why are they a Schedule I drug? They're at the very bottom of the list in terms of danger dose to the user and to others. The top of the list is alcohol that is actively promoted in our country. And it's a horrible drug, yet it's totally legal and you can advertise it. Where if you're growing magic mushrooms with no addictive properties to it, no toxicological problems to it, what's the game here? Let's come to our senses here, snap out of it. So I encourage you to sign the petition to legalize them. That's out here. It's in the booth outside in the courtyard. Next slide, please. And there are a couple of things going on. There's a Senate Bill 519 that is currently stalled in the assembly process in California. They're hoping to take it up this year, but as you imagine, there's quite a bit of resistance to the, primarily from the Republicans that don't want us to thinking outside of the box. But I won't get into politics here, but hopefully this will come up. Now there's another route here, next slide please, where it's more of a petition. Well, this is the guy that's authored Scott Wayner, and it's basically decriminalizing, meaning that even though it might technically be illegal, that our enforcement and judicial agencies cannot invest any money in investigating, prosecuting, incarcerating anybody involved with it, as long as that they're doing it somewhat on the down low. You know, they're not making a commercial enterprise on it and selling it in a schoolyard or something. So that's underway. And the next slide is a more of a initiative. We're trying to get enough signatures now to get it on the ballot coming this fall. So I encourage you to sign that. It's we have to get the signatures by the 15th. There's not many days left. I haven't heard how many signatures they've got, but you need to get that threshold to get it onto the ballot. Next slide, please. How am I doing for time?
You're doing good.
All right.
About another 15.
All right, so I'm not too bad. And how the psilocybin works is basically it increases interconnectivity in the brain, new pathways, new associations, and new ways of thinking outside the box. It's remarkable. It increases what is called brain plasticity, the interconnectedness and how different parts of your brain connect together. I don't know if you've ever heard of, how many people have seen the Fantastic Fungi documentary? A lot of people. So you kind of, that whole stoned ape theory of how possibly medicinal psychoactive psilocybin mushrooms, how that's we became human basically, how we developed language and arts and all that, and communication. So next slide, please. And there's a couple ways of doing these mushrooms. One is through microdosing, taken anywhere from 0.1 to 1 milligram. Now again, it depends on the species you're doing, because like I say, some species might have 10 times the psychoactive content of the next species. So that's kind of a range there. And then the other way is macrodosing, taking a heroic dose, which potentially, you know, basically your ego dissolves into the universe. You experience, some people say they experience God. Most people say it's one of the most significant and intense experiences of their life. They've done studies with religious leaders around the world where they've taken doses of magic mushrooms, and they came back and they didn't, even though it was induced by an outside agent, they didn't denigrate the value of their spiritual, mystical experience. It still had validity according to religious leaders. So it's not just some hippie drug-induced trance, stoned out hippie theory. These are significant life-changing events. So that being said, they can definitely change your life. So, we went through cannabis decriminalization and legalization. It's a little bit different than psilocybin. It's not so much a social drug. We got to treat it with respect, because these are very potent medicines, and you don't just take them casually. You should take them with intent, with preparation, and take the time to integrate the experience back into your life. Don't just go to a rave and then go back to work Monday morning. That's not how these things are designed to be used. To treat them with respect and go on them with preparation, intent, and be prepared. Sometimes you can have some not so pleasant experience, but as long as you remain open to the experience and learn with it, you're going to have some positive outcomes. They do, definitely in the clinical settings, they tend to screen out people with schizophrenia and the different things that maybe could go over the edge. And the clinical applications, it's important to note that they generally dose you with synthetic psilocybin, because they want to make sure they get the dose right. It's part of a study, so they want to, limit the variables. Where if you're taking it more in what I call the ceremonially shamanistic sort of experience, it's generally with the mushrooms themselves. And I think it's quite a different experience, because there's not only the psilocin and the psilocybin in these mushrooms, there's also a number of other compounds, and there's an entourage effect with these mushrooms, with all the whole food aspect of it. So it's a different experience than it is with synthetic ones. But you beware, some of these psychedelic therapists, they have, you got to make sure of their intent, their integrity, and their experience, because you want a good experienced guide, and you want to make use of the experience, which can be life changing. Like I say, so you want to make sure you set the stage right, and go in with a feeling of trust, and have trust with your therapist, not to be taken lightly. In other words, next one, please. Sure.
On the prior slide, you had a mention of niacin and lion's mane.
Uh-huh.
So are you microdosing those as well with psilocybin?
Well, the lion's mane, not so much a microdose. We recommend taking like about 2 grams of it. And the niacin, basically as big a dose as you can stand, because the niacin, the function of that is to provide a flush of blood to the brain to fuel that neurogenesis and that brain plasticity. So that's kind of the idea of combining those 3 things. Some people don't like niacin for the flush, but if you can tolerate the flush, it definitely intensifies the experience.
The niacin supplement would be daily?
You can take, niacin is the vitamin B3. You can take daily, but definitely if you're taking a dose of the psilocybin, take some that day as well. And one of the things I thought was significant was kind of the research going on. Way back in 2006, this researcher Griffiths at the Johns Hopkins Institute published a thing, psilocybin can occasion mystical experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and significant spiritual significance. Now, for a scientist, mystical experiences and spiritual significance are a hard thing to quantify scientifically. So generally they don't go there. They talk about, all sorts of different things. But he went through a whole series of things talking about that, and it changed people's minds that they've got some really otherworldly sort of properties to them. So I thought he's been a core researcher doing this stuff. And like I say, even religious leaders that experience these things find out that there's some validity to experiences. It's not just a drug-induced hysteria sort of thing. Next slide, please. And in that mode, you've probably seen some of the flyers around here. I originally saw this documentary up in the Telluride Mushroom Festival. It covers the history of using psychedelics all the way back from ancient times, from the Aztecs and so on, through the pre-war on drugs time, through the war on drugs time, and now through the current time where they're gaining use. So it's an excellent documentary. We're going to be showing it at the La Paloma Theater in March 31st at 6 p.m. and again at 9 p.m. After the 6 p.m. Showing, we're going to have the director of the documentary, as well as the panelists of local psychedelic therapists on a question and answer discussion thing. So if you can attend that, please do. It's sponsored by the Mycological Society and my company, Mushroom Superfood. So please attend. And then another showing at 9. They won't have the panel after that, but they're going to show a recording of the panel discussion. Next slide, please. Now, I talked a little bit, I covered healing the body, healing the mind to a degree. Now, how about healing the planet? Well, it's turning out that mushrooms are very important to the health of our planet. It's originally thought that there's a thing called mycorrhizal relationship, where the mycelium of a mushroom have an intimate relationship with the roots of a tree or a plant. It's a symbiotic relationship where both the plant and the mushroom benefits. The plant benefits by increased absorption of nutrients. It serves as kind of a firewall against pathogenic infections, and can shunt nutrients between different plants in the forest. Not only between same species in the forest, between different species, so that overall health of the forest benefits. The mushroom benefits by the shunting of photosynthetic carbohydrates from the photosynthesis above ground. So originally I thought there's only a few species that have that relationship. Now virtually all plants are finding, if it's a healthy plant, has a relationship with a fungus in the soil. And even possibly with carnivorous plants. That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Is it possible to overdo it with mushrooms? And I don't mean specifically psilocybin, but more like cordyceps and turkey tail, whether through eating it or through extracts. Is it possible to overdo it with them?
I would say particularly with extracts where they're concentrating isolated active ingredients, it's more like a pharmaceutical sort of drug. I would say definitely you can overdo it. With unextracted, more whole food sort of products, really I probably eat way more than recommended amount, and I'm doing reasonably well. So yeah, but what I found with these mushrooms, everybody interacts with them a bit differently. The experience of the same people, different people taking the same product can be quite different. Some people taking lion's mane say, God, I felt it the minute I took it. I was thinking clearer, I'm remembering things better. Other people saying, well, I didn't know whether it was doing anything. They only notice it after they ran out of it and they start to reduce back to their mental fog. Oh my God, this stuff was helping me. So it varies. And sometimes the effects can be gradual over time and depends on your health starting point. If you're a basket case, you've got a lot of room for improvement. If you're at the top of your game, you might be almost there. So it'll be incremental improvements that might be that noticeable. Next slide, please. So when people talk about the life going around them, they typically talk about flora and fauna. Where's the mushrooms in that? So there's a new movement out there and it sounds like it might be something like a nerdy mushroom thing. Well, we want our recognition well, so we want flora, fauna, and funga. So that, in a way, it is a nerdy thing, and we want mushrooms to have their recognition. But in a way, if we can get this more recognized and part of environmental and governmental policy, it'd make a huge difference, not only in terms of environmental priorities, but also funding. We've got, with such a large kingdom and so many species out there identified, we're losing species on a daily basis that we didn't even know we had. So getting that part of our environmental, studies before we do a project and looking at the health of forests and what's going on, it's important. So I encourage you to go to that florafauna.funga.org and get involved with it and encourage it. It can also be part of our curricula in schools. We can teach it as part of curriculum. And mushrooms are ignored in schools and even in biology, modern biology tests. Plants, have a big section of it, and generally the fungal section is like a tiny, in comparison to the plants, where you've got a much bigger kingdom, and it's not fair, It's not fair. My original training was in horticulture, and when I first studied mushrooms. It was in a plant pathology department. How's that for kind of a negative connotation? You study fungus in plant pathology. They're not. There are some definitely plant pathology sort of fungi, but it's a small percentage of them. Most times now there's actually more beneficial fungi to plants, not only as they inhabit the microbiome, the leaf microbiomes, the root microbiomes. They're not pathogens. There's some pathogens, but they're not all pathogens. Next slide, please. And I think Joshua talked a little bit about it, but it's turning out that really most of the carbon sequestration in our forests is not so much in the dead leaves and the litter and the logs. It's more in the fungal component of the forest. And so by conserving the fungal component of the forest, we also are sequestering carbon and hopefully helping with greenhouse gas warming emissions. And it tends to be that the mushrooms, when they sequester carbon, it's kind of long-term sequestering. It's not a short-term thing, as it is, and sometimes with more of the plant-based carbon sequestering. So next slide. And definitely mycorrhizal fungi have an important effect on plant health and also on soil tilth. So in modern agriculture practice, a lot of times they will inoculate seeds, or in the fertilizer include mycorrhizal inoculants. Now it's kind of a hit and miss game because there's in generally, if it's a healthy soil, there'd be mycorrhizal fungi that are best adapted to that environment and those conditions and that soil type. The idea that you can find a mycorrhizal species and introduce it as a foreign agent into the soil and it's going to take over is sometimes sketchy at best, but there has been some benefits done, but there's still a lot of work to be done in this area in terms of inoculation with mycorrhizal fungi and increased crop growth and forest health as well. Next slide. And here's just some pictures of corn that was inoculated with mycorrhizal inoculants versus uninoculated, and if you can include even in rangeland mycorrhizal species, you get a lot better growth and it's more sustainable, more drought resistant, and definitely better for the planet. Next slide. And then I think Joshua also talked a bit about mycoremediation, using mushrooms to break down toxin into simpler, less toxic compounds, using mushroom mycelium mats as filtration devices to filter water and purify it. A lot of work being done. There's a guy outside in the booth that's kind of specialized in that and some local products. It's gaining a lot of attention, using mushroom to detoxify effluents from dye factories, from pulp mills and whatnot. There's a lot of applications to it, but there's a lot of work to be done. So I encourage the young people, get involved in mushrooms. There's all sorts of opportunities, things we haven't even thought of yet. Even after 40 years of growing mushrooms, I'm continually humbled about how little I know. There's a lot of work to be done in it, and please get involved with it because it's important stuff. It really is. Next slide. Sure.
Hi, yes, really passionate subject. I was wondering if you had any data on adverse effects, on the more synthetic version, somebody that might want to try it.
The more synthetic.
Adverse effects. Any data on adverse effects?
When it's taken as internally as a medicine, as a supplement, you mean? Oh, psilocybin.
I was telling him that two friends of ours had psychotic episodes that were clinically dangerous after trying psilocybin. And so my question was, what percentage of people have, it opens up channels of psychosis in, and then do you always vomit with that type of trip?
No. Generally, the vomiting, no. In terms of definitely, if you've got some psychotic sort of issues or schizophrenia, generally, particularly in the clinical settings, they're very cautious about doing it. But people that are doing it on their own or say with a ceremonial basis that haven't been screened, there's definitely a danger. This is a powerful medicine, and it's not without risk, I would say. So you need to be cautious, and it's very individualist sort of experience, and.
Is there a way to get around that? Because in young 20s, someone wouldn't know if they were going to have a psychotic episode upcoming, but they usually
Yeah, it's not my field of expertise. I'd like it to be, but I'm scared to be working with Schedule 1 drugs at this point. But yeah, caution, and I would definitely, if you have psychotic issues, I would definitely recommend going more of a clinical experience as opposed to more of a ceremonially shamanistic one. And it's not without danger, definitely. It's powerful stuff. It's more some of the other things like peyote buttons and the ayahuasca make you vomit. Not so much with the mushrooms. You can have some queasiness for a little while, but it depends on how much you take, I guess too. And it turned out, we had a lot of forest fires this year, and it turns out that the recovery of burned areas, the fungal community is very important. They start to set the stage for this succession of plants and to get finally back to the climax community. And there's some really good research being done. Dr. Glassman up in the UC Riverside is doing some excellent work. And also Fabiola Polita Chavez. She actually gave a presentation here a couple of months back. The Mycological Society, she actually got a grant, our Ilio Shater, San Diego Mycological Society scholarship to further her work. So when you join the Mushroom Club here, the Mycological Society, you're helping some of this research done. So please think about joining. It's not expensive, $20 a year for your whole family, and then attend our monthly meetings. And if you can, the 4As, if you can. Next slide, please. Even after we die, the mushrooms can help. In terms of, instead of using fuel to cremate a body or putting in a casket that's been embalmed, why not do decompiculture? Use flesh-decaying mushroom fungi and bacteria to take your body back into the soil and detoxify all the pharmaceutical residues and all the toxins you've got in you, break them down and make yourself less toxic when you die to the planet. And previously, it was, the cemeteries didn't want, and the state didn't want anything to do with it. This is a little bit too funky. More and more cemeteries and states are allowing this. You have to plan for it and prepare for it and kind of make sure you're picking the right spot, but it's gaining more widespread acceptance. And this is just a little bit, kind of a little bit repeat of Joshua's tip, is using mycelium to make alternative non-styrofoam packaging materials, non-plastic packaging materials, and also mushroom mycelium-based building materials, bricks, structural members and whatnot. By varying the species that you grow, by varying the substrate you grow on it, the particle size, and then the temperature and pressure that you process the mycelium with, you can get some very fire-resistant, moisture-resistant building materials. And there's a lot of people doing some wonderful work with this. Including this Jeff with Okram Works Labs, that he's around here answering questions. Next slide, please. There's some building materials, mushroom-based. Basically, when you treat the mycelium that is, and then on the substrate with the heat and pressure, the polysaccharides in the mushrooms are converted to resins that then are the glue that's sticking together. And so instead of using synthetic resins for like a particle board, the polysaccharides in the mushroom actually becomes the glue, the resins that holds the whole thing together. Next slide. Most of you, I encourage you to watch this documentary. It's really brought the attention and the awareness of mushrooms. It's streaming now on Netflix. It's available. It's an entertaining and informative show. Next slide. Mycelium Running. It's by my friendly competitor and mentor to an extent, Paul Stamets. Again, a ambitious title, How Mushrooms Can Help Save the World, but just an indication of how us mushroom guys get excited about mushrooms. We can save the world, right? Next slide, please. And then for further reading, there's a number of really good books out there, particularly if you're interested in the medicinal effects of mushrooms. This Fungal Pharmacy by Robert Dale Rogers is an excellent reference book. The California Mushroom book, in terms of identifying local California mushrooms, is a really good book. Entangled Life is like a really good read of just expanding your mind of what the possibilities of what mushrooms can do, of how they do so many unseen things that we're not even aware about, that we're just gradually catching on to. So there's a lot of resources to go to mushrooms with. That How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan really describes kind of the history and the different considerations for using different psychoactive agents to change your mind, to open up your mind. So next slide. And I guess that's it. Thank you all for bearing with me.